Well, I had everybody sit up here on the premise that maybe since a lot of this discussion bears more directly on policy concerns, there might be disagreement or debate. And so I was hoping that when questions are asked, given the nature of the presentations, there might be less about specific studies and more about where this all leads. So we're open for questions. Hopefully we'll have comments from a couple of different sources, and do remember to wait for the microphone because someone's recording everything. And if any of you are ever going to be before the United States Senate for confirmation, they will require you to produce, to get from this organization and produce a videotape of this event so that your public statements will be known to the Senate. And as Stephen points out, someone's going to leak it to YouTube. All right.
Oh, that's really put me off asking my question. Okay, so this is a question for the lawyers, but it refers to things that Reid raised and what Nicholas just raised now, and something that has come out today. So obviously, from the scientific perspective, we work in probabilities. We work in doubt. We're all about the error, and we're all about, you know, not categorizing things, going to a more parametric, distributed understanding. As I've understood, the legal world, you know, works in a binary categorical system, although we do have that expression beyond reasonable doubt. So I'm just wondering, could the lawyers speak about whether there's a threshold of probability which you sort of intuitively use when you use that expression, and do you see that we can bring these two completely different frameworks in which we both work together? Because I see that as a real problem.
Well, it's a deep question. First, of course, all knowledge is at some level about probabilities, right? There's always some percentage chance that one is wrong, no matter how certain something may seem. So if you ask what do you know or how do you know it, there's always some margin of potential error. What makes the legal system more binary is not that we're not aware of that or we don't take it into account. It's that we have to make a binary choice. It may not be a stark binary choice. It may not be, does the person get executed or does he walk free among us? There are graduated choices as well. But we have to decide, are we going to intervene or not? Are we going to take a decision or not? And it's got to be based on what we know about this particular case. So I think the issue of probabilities is not so much that we don't work in probabilities. I don't know whether beyond a reasonable doubt means a 90% likelihood or an 88% likelihood, and I wouldn't know how to measure what the likelihood is given the imprecision of the data that we have. So if somebody told me you have to be 90% certain, I wouldn't know if I was 90% certain. But it's a social judgment that you have to be, as one of my colleagues once said, pretty damn sure before you'll take this kind of action. I think the issue with probabilities is if you're working with a probabilistic judgment that is spread across a population such that you can say it is more likely that this person rather than that person will take a particular action in the future. Or we know that across a population, people with this characteristic are more likely to have done something than not. The translation of that to an individual to decide, did this individual do this? Are we going to intervene in this person's life is what the problem is. It's not that we don't think in terms of probabilities.
There's a really good example of this in law where we actually do use the probabilities, although it's not at all a certain probability. We have in the United States, in every jurisdiction, involuntary civil commitment of people with mental disorders if they are suffering from a mental disorder, and as a result they are, and the statutory language changes from jurisdiction, likely to be dangerous, probable to be dangerous. And mental health professionals come in, and often not using very good evidence, but sometimes using better evidence, actuarial evidence or semi-structured interviews, which we know are always more accurate for future prediction than a pure clinical interview. They will say things like more likely than not. Now, they've got a probabilistic model in their mind. Interestingly enough, if you look at professionals, you give them a scenario where they anchor the scale. If you do it like, let's say, what's the probability? It's 1 in 100, 2 in 100, 3 in 100, 4 in 100, as opposed to 10 in 100, 20 in 100, 30 in 100. They will anchor the scale lower if you use the smaller amounts, and they'll anchor the scale higher, although the distributions look just the same. So they're not doing science, really. They're doing something else. But based on these predictions, we will lock people up for very long periods of time. We'll treat them involuntarily and the like. So the law does take account of probabilities. Now, there's one final further point. Can you use statistical evidence? So, for example, we know the likelihood that the perpetrator of a violent crime in the United States is between 7 and 10 times more likely to be an XY than an XX. And now suppose the question is, gee, was this a man or was this a woman? Right? We can't use that kind of evidence by and large, even though it's obviously highly relevant. Now, for prediction purposes and involuntary commitment, we know that men are more likely to be violent. And Kent's example of psychopathy is a risk factor with all its problems. Jed?
So there's another kind of area where probabilism, if there's such a word, comes into play. And that is in the United States in civil toxic tort class action cases, which for the folks from the UK, if they're not familiar with this, these are very big cases. They are typically individual and personal injury cases that share common factors and therefore are glommed together in one great big litigation. And so, for example, I had a case a number of years ago where the question was, does ephedra cause heart attacks and strokes? Ephedra being a plant that's now been banned. And this was addressed in a Daubert hearing at the so-called general causation level, before the 800-plus cases were broken down into their specific facts. And the determination had to be made whether the plaintiff's experts would be allowed to testify that as a probabilistic matter, ephedra could in certain circumstances cause heart attacks and strokes. If I had ruled that out, which I did not, the cases would have been over at that time. So there is a role here for this more general kind of stuff. It's not totally foreign to the legal system.
Right. And then, of course, before anybody got actual damages, someone had to look into their particular, a jury presumably would look into their particular case and decide whether they were somebody who had other risk factors.
As what happened, of course, was that after I made my general decision,
the case settled,
so.
Yes.
Of course.
Morris?
A couple comments.
One second, Morris.
Oh, wait, this is going to be taken.
Yeah.
I've changed my question. A couple comments. To follow up on what Judd said, I think probabilism, this probabilistic cause, is everywhere in the law. It's everywhere. It's in lineups. It's in forensic, quote, science, unquote. It's everywhere. And I think one of the interesting things that this biological view of law can give us is to maybe suggest that one of the things humans aren't so good at is some risk, is judging some kinds of probabilities. And so there might be some areas of dissonance in the law about whenever we deal with probabilities. But the other thing I wanted to say was I loved Nicholas's presentation, but I wanted to suggest that maybe one of the reasons Planet Europe cares more about prediction is because Planet Europe is in galaxy rehabilitation. More than Planet US is in. And that maybe this, and with less of a libertarian tradition and less skepticism about a muscular government interfering with individuals and all of those political aspects of your views about criminology. And I was wondering if you'd comment on that.
Yeah, so should I get this? First of all, I have to plead an excusing condition of jet lag, but I'll definitely do my best. I wish you were right about Planet Europe being in a rehabilitative mode. Certainly Planet UK or Planet England is not in a very rehabilitative mode, and the consequences of risk prediction, of predicting that a person is at high risk of reoffending or of remaining a sexual predator and so on, is, as I tried to indicate, increasingly the use of indeterminate sentences where the decision as to whether or not the individual should be released at the end of their sentence is entirely in the hands of experts. My concern, in a sense, whilst I don't like to say this amongst a lot of lawyers and judges, I think lawyers and judges are quite good at sorting out some of these issues and holding accounts from scientists to some kind of criteria of accuracy, etc., etc., etc. What worries me is what happens outside those courtroom contexts. And outside those courtroom contexts, the judgments of experts tend to be unchallenged. They're not in a combative situation. The evidence that they use to reach their judgment is not placed in the public domain. And yet their judgments have, in many cases, as severe effect on the individual as the decisions that are made in the courtroom. Now, I'm no sort of woolly-minded liberal. I think there are a lot of nasty people out there, but I think what one knows about risk predictions is that risk predictions always over-predict risk, because under-predicting risk leads the person who has made that under-prediction of risk liable to some kind of culpability. So one sees a kind of defensive practice going on when this risk assessment is happening. As it happens, I've done quite a lot of work a few years ago with forensic psychiatrists who are often required to do that risk prediction, who feel everything that I say about them are things that they feel themselves. They know they are unable to make these risk predictions, but they know that in a sense they are obliged to make these risk predictions, and if they don't make them, then they hand over the responsibility of doing that to someone who is even less likely to make an accurate risk prediction. So I think they're in a very, very difficult situation.
Yes,
I thought I might just make a general remark about how neuroscience works, because I think it might help our thinking about how it's relevant to the law. And part of this extends to the comments that we make, what I say, if you agree with it at all. And that is, it was a long time thought that the way to think about it is that psychology does the formalism and neuroscience does the implementation. In that sense, neuroscience is just simply the mechanism. But history shows us, in fact, that actually neuroscience helps us understand formalism, helps us discover formalism, and there's many examples of that. So I would say then that discussions about the utility of psychology for the law is very much the same kind of discussion about the relevance of neuroscience to the law. It's not a separate discussion about the relevance of neuroscience.
Reed, do you want to comment?
Yeah, I can't decide whether you attacked me or agreed with me. Yeah, I think so. I'm just kidding. There's no distinction in my group between sort of physicalists that study signals inside cells, outside cells, between networks of neurons, and what I call psychologists of the mathematical type that are working on sophisticated models of behavior and perception. These are disciplines that have started to fuse. Just look at Anthony Wagner's work. I mean, what would you call that exactly? I mean, he's in a psychology department, but it really is in this intermediate zone. But that's where things are lacking the most, I think, is right in between, where these two fields meet. I tried to put my finger on it earlier, and as I said something I haven't said before, which is there is this sort of software domain in between circuit T's. There's this lexicon that's missing in between circuit T's, talking about circuits and how they work, and psychologies, the old style, let's say 60 years ago. And that's going to have to develop, I think, a lot more and get a lot more discriminating and fine-grained before you see anything like a facile use of it in cases where things are really kind of hard. On the other hand, lie detection is if you had a use for detecting lies and deciding whether somebody's lying, the fMRI lie detection field has stunned me in how the reliability they're getting, and again, in restricted domains. So that may grow faster than people imagine. It certainly has surprised me. So
I just want a brief comment. That what you said is precisely what I was trying to get at, I hope, and I think you said it much more clearly, about a reflective conceptual scientific equilibrium where we use the neuroscience to refine the psychology and vice versa. And I think that task would be massively helped if we had that intermediate lexicon that Reed is talking about.
And could I just say one word? If I heard Reed right, he used the phrase mental states. We do know that human beings have mental states. And I think, by and large, everybody in this room believes that mental states have some kind of causal relation to the actions that human beings have. But I think if we, as so much neuroscience does, elide those mental states, or saying the mental states are subserved by or clearly determined by or caused by or whatever. And a lot of the comments that we've heard here in this discussion have kind of used a whole series of metaphors to account for the way in which those underlying mechanisms generate behavior, their causes, their determinants, etc., etc., etc. We do not have a clear understanding of what the relationship is between those neurobiological mechanisms and mental states. It's a very, very obvious thing to say, but it seems to me to be rather an important one. And that seems to me where that crucial question, the explanatory gap, it lies there exactly as it lay there 50 years ago, it seems to me.
I'd like to comment on that, just because it's a historic. There's a history to that, which is when I started in neurobiology, very low level neurobiology. How does a synapse work? How do you the biophysical constraints and really small chunks of tissue, which is why I carry these numbers around in my head. The Society for Neuroscience meeting now has 40,000 abstracts in it, right? The rule was 25 years ago that you could go there and you could study signals in cells, signals between cells. You could do all these nice physical techniques, and you could marvel everyone's, latest and greatest. But you couldn't really wax philosophical about the psychology or how. And the hope was that somehow you just work on the neural part, and these things will sift into categories. So I left. So I left the area and moved in and learned psychology in the gutter. But there's also this pressure down from psychology to not. There's a glass floor, if you will, in psychology. And so what's left out is something like taking mental states, or the idea of that, seriously. One good hypothesis is that we're evolved biological creatures. Evolution it's not really looking at a particular mechanism in your head. It may constrain it in a way. It probably was looking at these things that sort of underlay your proximate behavior. It probably selected you for these things. And they're just not worked on. And I can imagine somebody coming to me and saying, there's something wrong with my brain made me do it because I'm missing my left amygdala, and mounting an argument. Somebody else could do it other than me, but you could mount this intermediate argument saying, you really can't tell me how this connects to the things that would be the proximate cause of your behavior, and so you don't really have I can see that getting argued out. The science is just young on that account.
I keep thinking of the importance of putting this in the context of other sciences moving into law. And genetics just keeps coming back at me on this. Another profoundly probabilistic science, one that has struggled to move from correlation to causation, witnessed some of the disappointments surrounding genome-wide association studies built really on using powerful informatics to look for correlations between genotype and phenotype, but in a way that hasn't really elucidated very effectively much. But a science that's progressed to some more causal explanations of some things. But what impresses me, and it's more in the domain of legislation than it is in adjudicated cases, is that in the U.S., we've created real breaks on the use of genetics. For instance, GINA, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act, which is a federal statute that says you can't use genetics in some insurance and employment contexts, and there's state analogs. Where we've seen legislation say stop to the use of genetics has not been because the genetics was bad. It's been because the genetics was good. It's because there was a further layer of policymaking and decision-making about, okay, but do we really want to use it? What are some of the ill consequences? Now, some of those decisions, of course, are affected by the history of eugenics and some of the specific history that surrounds genetics. But I think it's salutary to think about, okay, well, once we know more in the realm of neuro, once we actually have good causal neuro, are we really going to want to use it? And for what? I mean, I think these breaks in genetics are partly because of concern about discrimination, struggles to redefine discrimination when we can actually locate difference. not wanting to disincentivize people's therapeutic use of the science, but I sort of want to push to that level of, I think it's a trap to think, well, the thing is we'll just get the science really good enough, because that's just the predicate for then the further policy and legal decision, which ought to be often to reject using it nonetheless.
Well, this is what I was getting at in my introductory remarks. It's not that lawyers are, as a profession, necessarily imperialist, though we may be. It's that ultimately these are political decisions as to how we're going to use these things. And they're complex, and people do tend to look to the criminal justice model as a locus of a lot of this, and rightly so, because this is an area where the government is taking the most dramatic possible actions against citizens. So it's important to think, well, how are we going to use this way? But I keep coming back to Hank's talk about the spectrum of possible issues. It is another aspect of neuroscience and law. Will the polity, will the people allow corporations to make certain uses of this kind of information? And maybe that's where a lot of the action is going to be. It's sort of like, we used to worry about the government being Big Brother and snooping on everything. Now we freely turn over lots of our information to companies, from Facebook to anybody we order online from. And then we start to worry, well, what are they going to do with that information? And then it's up to government at some level. It's up to the people to decide, are we going to allow this or are we not? So the genetic non-discrimination is about a healthcare and health insurance set of issues as much as, well, it's largely about that. And I think you're right. If the genetics is good or is perceived to be good, then insurance companies are going to use it to decide whom to insure, and then there may need to be a meta decision about whether that's the way we want to do our risk pools and give out our healthcare resources. And I imagine the same thing is going to be true with neuro information as well.
Could I just give one valuable reference about genetics? It's 10 years after the publication of the sequence of the human genome, and Eric Lander wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago in Nature assessing what we knew and what we didn't know about the human genome. And just a classic, very, very clear statement that the more we know about the human genome, the more we realize how very, very little we know. There are masses and masses of sequences in the human genome that are evolutionarily conserved, so they must do something, but they don't code for proteins, and what they do code for, we have absolutely no idea. So 10 years down the line, we're realizing just how wrong even our complex models of gene-environment interaction were. And it seems to me if that's the case about the genome, it's probably the case about neuroscience as well, which doesn't mean stop doing the research. It just means, as everybody's saying here on the panel, I think, be incredibly modest about what the implications can be in domains which are a very, very long way away from the synapse or the neurotransmitter or the single nucleotide polymorphism or whatever it happens to be.
I want to make a comment about Susan's comment as well. It's a speculation, wild speculation, but I think it's probably true. I said in my talk that many people think how consciousness is possible, how the brain enables the mind. The brain-mind action connection may be the hardest problem there is in science. There are people, as many of you probably know, they're called Mysterians, who work in this area, who believe it's so hard it's beyond human resources to solve. I'm agnostic on that issue. But here's what I do think. I think if the neuro or the genetics or the combination between them and other sciences ever get good enough that we finally do understand how the brain enables the mind, my prediction would be this will revolutionize our biological understanding of ourselves. This will revolutionize our view of personhood. And I don't know what the world is going to look like at that point. It's not a world I'm sure I want to live in at all, so I'm glad it's not likely to happen in my lifetime. But I think if we ever get there, it will then genuinely be potentially revolutionary but we're nowhere near there yet.
Well, that sounds like a good place. And we have on my schedule, it says we adjourn at 5:15. It's been a very long day, and we've pressed very hard, and if we stop 6.5 minutes early, I don't think anybody's going to complain. So I declare adjournment. And thank you to the panel.